The air in the grand foyer of Willow Creek didn't smell like grief. It smelled like industrial-strength floor wax and predatory ambition. My daughter, Seraphina, stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her silhouette framed by the rolling North Carolina hills that my husband, Arthur, had spent 40 years manicuring into a private kingdom. When she turned to me, her eyes weren't red from weeping. They were calculating, darting across the antique sideboard as if she were already mentally slapping "sold" stickers on the family silver. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you are from. Mother, she said, her voice dropping into a register of manufactured solemnity, we need to discuss the logistics of your transition. This house, it's a mausoleum. It's a drain on the estate's liquidity. You're 67, and frankly, your recent lapses in memory regarding the grocery list suggest you aren't fit to manage a 40-room Georgian manor. I sat on the edge of a velvet settee, my hands trembling, not from age, but from the sheer, staggering audacity of her tone. Arthur had been in the ground for exactly 12 days. He was 74 when the stroke took him, a man of monolithic presence who had governed our lives with the quiet efficiency of a Swiss watch. I had been his shadow, the invisible architect of his comfort, the woman who ensured his scotch was always neat and his scandals never reached the local papers. Transition? I whispered. Seraphina, I've lived in Willow Creek since before you were a heartbeat. This isn't a mausoleum. It's my home. That's when Julian stepped out from Arthur's study. Julian, the son-in-law I had personally financed through a shady liquidity crisis 3 years ago, was adjusting his cufflinks with the smug precision of a man who had just won a lottery he didn't enter. Eleanor, Julian said, his voice a velvet-wrapped blade. We've reviewed the 2024 updated estate filings. According to the documents Arthur signed 6 months ago, the entirety of the $52 million portfolio, including the deed to Willow Creek, passes directly to Seraphina. You were granted a life insurance payout of $250,000 and a recommendation for a senior lifestyle transition facility. We've already taken the liberty of packing your essentials. The physical blow of his words was followed by a clinical efficiency that left me breathless. Within 2 hours, my 38 years of marriage were reduced to 2 weather-beaten suitcases and a cardboard box of photographs. Seraphina watched from the doorway, checking her platinum Rolex with an expression of mild inconvenience. There's a charming place on Maple Street, Mother. The Sunset Gardens. Very affordable. It's important to preserve the estate's capital for the grandchildren's trust funds. You understand, don't you? It's just basic fiscal responsibility. Julian loaded my suitcases into the trunk of their onyx black BMW with the detached speed of a man disposing of garbage. As he drove me away from the wrought iron gates of Willow Creek, I watched my life disappear in the rearview mirror. I had nursed Arthur through 3 surgeries. I had raised Seraphina through every mercurial tantrum and expensive whim. Now I was being dropped at a budget motel like an unwanted guest who had stayed a decade too long. The Starlight Inn was a monument to desolation. The carpet was a shade of brown that suggested decades of forgotten spills, and the walls were so thin I could hear the rhythmic drone of a television in the next room. Julian handed me $200 in crumpled 20s and a business card for a moving company. "We'll have the rest of your personal effects sent to a storage unit once we finish the redecoration of the master suite," he said, finally meeting my eyes with a look of unfiltered contempt. "Don't make this difficult, Eleanor. The law is the law." I spent that first night sitting on a bed that sagged like a defeated spirit, staring at the yellowed wallpaper. But as the hours crawled toward dawn, a glimmer of cold clarity began to pierce through my shock. Arthur Vance had been many things: autocratic, secretive, and occasionally patronizing about my domestic sphere. But he was also meticulous to the point of pathology. He didn't do things by halves, and he certainly didn't leave his wife of 4 decades to rot in a $45 a night motel while his little princess lived in a $50 million fortress. He had shown me the will 2 years ago, a document that spoke of marital trusts, Q-tip arrangements, and protective clauses. He had walked me through the tax implications of our joint holdings with the patience of a professor. The man who had sent me peonies every Tuesday for 40 years wouldn't have signed a document that referred to me as a lifestyle transition candidate. The next morning, I used the motel's glacial Wi-Fi to find a name I hadn't thought of in years: Barnaby Sterling. Barnaby had been Arthur's primary counsel for 30 years, a man who preferred old-world ethics to Julian's modern hedge fund aggression. I took a bus downtown, my fingers clutching my purse as if it were a life raft. Barnaby's office was a sanctuary of leather-bound books and silence. When his secretary announced my name, the door to his private office flew open. Barnaby stood there, his face paling to the color of parchment.
"Eleanor? My God, woman! Seraphina told me you were in a private sanitarium in the Alps. She said you'd had a complete nervous collapse after the funeral and refused to see anyone."
"Do I look like I'm in the Alps, Barnaby?" I asked, my voice trembling with a new, dangerous energy. Barnaby ushered me inside and locked the door. He didn't offer tea. He went straight to a massive steel safe in the corner.
"Arthur updated his will 6 months before he died,"
Barnaby said, his hands moving with feverish urgency.
"But he didn't do it with me. He used a boutique firm in Chicago. However, he sent me a notarized shadow copy for safekeeping, with very specific instructions to keep it hidden, unless a certain trigger event occurred."
"What event?" I asked.
"He called it the Ingratitude Protocol,"
Barnaby whispered. He laid the document on the desk. It was heavy, professional, and bore Arthur's unmistakable, bold signature. As I read, the blood in my veins turned to liquid nitrogen. I, Arthur J. Vance, being of sound mind and fully aware of the predatory nature of my offspring, the document began. It didn't just leave me the house, it left me 70% of the entire $52 million portfolio, outright. The house, the cars, the art, and the liquid capital were mine. But it was the contingency clause in Section 4.2 that made my heart stop. To my daughter, Seraphina Vance Hayes, I leave a conditional trust of $14 million. However, this distribution is strictly contingent upon her treatment of her mother. Should Seraphina or her spouse Julian Hayes attempt to evict, marginalize, or financially abuse Eleanor Vance, the entirety of the $14 million trust shall be immediately forfeited and reverted to Eleanor Vance, alongside an additional $5 million penalty from the corporate holdings. Barnaby looked at me, his eyes shining with vindictive joy.
Eleanor, by kicking you out and lying about your whereabouts, Seraphina didn't just commit a moral sin. She triggered a financial suicide clause. She hasn't just lost the house. She's just handed you her entire $14 million inheritance.
I leaned back in the chair, a chilled smile touching my lips for the first time in weeks. "So, Barnaby," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat, "how do we begin the process of informing my daughter that she is now, effectively, an unauthorized squatter in my home?" Barnaby didn't let me return to the Starlight Inn. He drove me himself to a discreet, high-security condominium he kept for clients in transition. It was a fortress of brushed steel and silent elevators, overlooking the rolling hills.
"We need a team, Eleanor," Barnaby said, pacing the length of the slate-gray living room. "This isn't just a probate dispute anymore. If Seraphina and Julian produced a document that looked enough like Arthur's signature to fool the bank's automated verification systems, they've crossed into federal felony territory. This is systematic fraud."
He introduced me to Beatrix Vane. She was a woman who looked like she was carved out of flint and spreadsheets. A forensic accountant with a reputation for being a numbers assassin, Beatrix arrived with 3 high-powered laptops and an appetite for corporate blood.
"Arthur wasn't just a consultant, Eleanor," Beatrix said,
her eyes never leaving the cascading lines of data on her screen.
"He was a financial cartographer. He mapped out routes for money that shouldn't have existed. Over the last 48 hours, I've been peeling back the layers of the Vance Global Initiative. It's a labyrinth of shell companies, mostly LLCs, registered in Delaware and Nevis."
I watched her work, feeling a strange detachment from the man I had shared a bed with for nearly 4 decades. "He told me he was helping emerging markets," I whispered. "He said he was stabilizing international currencies." Beatrix gave a short, humorless laugh.
"He was stabilizing something, all right, but it wasn't the peso." "Eleanor, I found a series of ghost accounts, funds that move in synchronicity with the Luciano Syndicate's quarterly earnings. We're talking about $120 million in laundered capital over the last decade alone."
The revelation should have shattered me, but instead, it felt like the final piece of a jagged puzzle falling into place. Arthur's late-night phone calls in the study, the sudden business trips to Zurich and Macau, the way he would sometimes look at Seraphina with a mixture of adoration and profound dread. He wasn't just protecting her from the world. He was protecting her from his world. "And Julian?" I asked. "Does he know?"
"Julian Hayes is many things,"
Beatrix replied, clicking a folder labeled Project Icarus.
"A mediocre hedge fund manager, a subpar husband, and a clumsy criminal. I've traced his IP address to a series of unauthorized logins into Arthur's private servers just 3 days after the funeral. He didn't just find the money. He tried to hijack the laundering pipeline. That will they showed you? It was a crude fabrication, designed to give them immediate, unquestioned access to the primary domestic accounts before the syndicate realized the cleaner was dead."
The stakes had suddenly shifted. This wasn't just about a house or an inheritance anymore. We were sitting on a powder keg of international crime, and my daughter was holding a lit match, thinking she was merely lighting a celebratory cigar. The knock on the door at 6 a.m. the following morning wasn't the police. It was something far more imposing. Special Agent Marcus Thorne of the FBI looked exactly like a man who spent his life chasing ghosts. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than my motel stay, but looked like it had been lived in for a week.
"Mrs. Vance," Thorne said, sitting across from me and placing a burnished leather dossier on the table. "I'm going to be very direct with you. We've been tracking your husband for 12 years. He was the single most effective money launderer the east of the Mississippi has seen since the Prohibition era."
I felt the air leave my lungs. Then why wasn't he in prison?
Thorne's expression softened into something resembling grim respect. "Because for the last 8 of those years, he was our star witness. Arthur Vance was a confidential human source. He provided us with the metadata and the routing numbers for the Luciano Syndicate's entire European network. He was playing the most dangerous double game in history."
I closed my eyes, picturing Arthur at the breakfast table, complaining about the toast, while secretly dismantling a criminal empire from his iPad.
"We were planning to bring him into witness protection next month," Thorne continued. "The stroke was an unforeseen variable. But now, your daughter and her husband have stepped into the middle of an active federal operation. Julian's attempts to move that money have tripped every silent alarm we have. If the syndicate finds out he's trying to skim from their accounts, they won't send a lawyer. They'll send a cleaner."
The plan was hatched in the cold, clinical light of Barnaby's boardroom. Agent Thorne needed a confession of the forgery and the extortion attempt to officially seize the accounts and place me under federal protection. "I have to go back to Willow Creek," I said, my voice surprising me with its ironclad resolve. "I have to let them think they've won. I have to let Julian try to settle with me." Thorne looked hesitant.
"It's high risk, Eleanor. Julian is desperate. Desperate men are unpredictable."
"He's not unpredictable," I countered. "He's arrogant. He thinks I'm a broken old woman who doesn't understand the difference between a mutual fund and a grocery coupon. He'll brag. Men like Julian can't help themselves when they think they've outsmarted someone." 2 hours later, I was standing in the foyer of Willow Creek. The house looked the same, but the energy had curdled. Seraphina had already replaced my favorite landscape paintings with aggressive, abstract canvases that looked like splatters of dried blood. "Mother?" Seraphina descended the stairs, her silk robe trailing behind her like a vulture's wings. "I thought we were clear. This unannounced visit behavior is exactly why we suggested the facility on Maple Street." "I'm not here to argue, Seraphina," I said, touching a hand to my chest where the microtransmitter was hidden beneath my blouse. "I'm here to talk about the settlement Julian mentioned. I can't live on $200 in a dream. I need to know the truth about your father's will." Julian appeared from the study, a glass of Arthur's 30-year-old Highland Park in his hand. He looked at me with a sinister grin.
Eleanor, always the martyr."
He sighed, leaning against the doorframe.
"You want the truth? Fine. The truth is that your husband was a criminal mastermind, and he left behind a mess that only a modern thinker like myself can navigate. The will we showed you? It was a necessary fiction, a placeholder, to keep the banks from freezing the assets while I rerouted the Luciano funds into our private offshore trusts.
So you forged it, I said, my heart hammering against the wire.
I optimized it, Julian corrected, his voice rising with narcissistic pride. Arthur was a dinosaur. He was too scared to take the real cream off the top. I'm giving Seraphina the life she deserves. We're moving $30 million by Friday. You? You get a nice, quiet room with a view of a park, and enough of a stipend to keep you in knitting needles. That's the deal. Sign the NDA and the waiver of claim, or I'll make sure the Luciano people know exactly where you're staying. And believe me, Eleanor, they aren't as considerate as I am.
Seraphina stepped beside him, her face a mask of cold indifference. Don't be a victim, Mom. It's unbecoming. Take the money and go. You're useless to this family now. I looked at my daughter, the girl I had rocked to sleep, the woman I had defended against every failure. She wasn't just my child. She was a mirror of her father's darkest traits, with none of his honor. You're right, Seraphina, I said, stepping back toward the door. I am useless to this version of the family.
Is that a yes?
Julian asked, reaching for a pen. No, I replied, hearing the faint sound of tires crunching on gravel outside. That's a goodbye. As the front door burst open and the shouting of federal agents filled the vaulted ceiling of the foyer, I didn't stay to watch the handcuffs go on. I walked out onto the porch into the bracing North Carolina wind and looked up at the gray sky. For the first time in 43 years, I could finally breathe. The silence that followed the departure of the federal transport vans was unlike any I had experienced at Willow Creek. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a country morning. It was the heavy, ringing silence of a tomb that had finally been sealed. Agent Thorne stood on the porch with me, his silhouette sharp against the deepening North Carolina twilight.
The Luciano assets are being frozen as we speak, Eleanor,
Thorne said, his voice a low rumble.
Arthur's cooperation was the key. Because he was an active asset, the Department of Justice is treating the $52 million as civilian compensation. It's clean, it's legal, and it's yours.
I looked back at the grand stone entrance, the light from the foyer spilling out across the gravel. No, Marcus, I'm not running anymore. I spent 40 years being a ghost in this house. It's time. I became the owner. 3 days later, the next gen of the Betrayal arrived. Eleanor Hayes Sr., Julian's mother. She was a woman of calcified elegance, draped in cashmere and wearing pearls that looked like they had been harvested from the depths of a cold, indifferent ocean. "This is a grotesque display of vindictiveness, Eleanor," she began, her voice clipped and aristocratic. "Julian is a man of standing. Seraphina is a mother. To involve the federal government in a domestic misunderstanding it's unpardonable." "A misunderstanding, Eleanor? They forged a will, evicted me from my home, and threatened to feed me to the Luciano family," I replied, pouring myself a tea I didn't intend to share. "In my world, we call that criminal conspiracy." "Name your price," she snapped, stopping mid-pace. "The Hayes family has resources. We will offer you $10 million in liquid capital, tax-free, deposited into a Swiss account of your choosing. In exchange, you will testify that the wire was a theatrical exercise, that you were under duress, and that the forgery was a draft you had previously approved. We can make the fraud charges vanish with the right legal friction. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the exact DNA of entitlement that had poisoned my daughter. They believed that everything, even a mother's soul, had a market value. "You're late, Eleanor," I said, standing up. "The FBI already has the forensic trail from Julian's office. They have the IP logs. And most importantly, they have my heart. Your $10 million is blood money to me. My answer is no. And if you ever set foot on Willow Creek property again, I'll have the security team treat you as the hostile entity you are." The media circus that followed was a whirlwind of flashbulbs and vitriol. The story of the mother's revenge became a national obsession. I watched from the safety of Willow Creek as Seraphina and Julian were arraigned in a federal courthouse in Charlotte. Seraphina tried to play the victim, her lawyers arguing that her emotional instability was a result of her father's death. It was a pathetic, transparent tactic. I was called to testify. Walking into that courtroom, I felt the eyes of 1,000 strangers on me. I saw Seraphina in the defendant's chair, her hair unkempt, her designer clothes replaced by a drab charcoal suit. For a fleeting second, the mother in me wanted to reach out. But then she caught my eye and mouthed a word that was so full of hate it burned. I didn't flinch. I told the truth. I told the court about the Starlight Inn. I told them about the $200. I told them about Arthur's Ingratitude Protocol. The judge, a man who looked like he had seen the worst of humanity, didn't show mercy.
"This was not a crime of passion,"
he noted during sentencing.
"This was a premeditated assassination of a mother's dignity for the sake of a larger yacht."
Julian received 6 years. Seraphina received 42 months. With the legal battles behind me, the $52 million felt less like a fortune and more like a responsibility. I spent the next year systematically undoing the Vance name and replacing it with something better. I founded the Willow Creek Sanctuary for Elder Justice. We took $20 million of the portfolio and built a legal aid network for seniors facing financial abuse. We hired investigators like Beatrix Vane to hunt down the Julians of the world before they could strike. But the most important change was internal. I finally stepped into Arthur's study with a sledgehammer. I knocked down the dark oak built-ins that housed his secrets. I replaced the heavy masculine rugs with light-drenched hardwood. I installed skylights that invited the North Carolina sun to bleach out the shadows of money laundering and syndicate meetings. I turned the room into an art studio. I hadn't picked up a brush since 1988, the year I decided Arthur's dreams were more important than my colors. Now, I spend my mornings painting landscapes of hope. I paint the rolling hills not as Arthur saw them, as assets, but as they are, wild, free, and belonging to no one. 6 months into her sentence, a letter arrived from Seraphina. It wasn't an apology. It was a request for a loan to cover her legal appeals. I sat at my easel, the smell of linseed oil and turpentine in the air, and read it twice. Then I walked to the fireplace and watched the paper curl into ash. Some people think the end of a story like this should involve a tearful reconciliation. But that's not how the world works. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself to stop the poison from spreading. It doesn't mean you have to invite the poisoner back to the table. I am 68 now. I am a retiree, a homeowner, a painter, and a survivor. I am the woman who proved that the pawn doesn't just become the queen. She redesigns the board.